It's really an honor to get asked to speak first, but of course the reason is that fighting poverty and inequality begins with jobs. And it's really important to keep the focus on jobs even when we see headlines like this, which many of you have probably seen. Unemployment's at an all-time low, so what's the big deal? We're done. Not so. Partly because the traditional unemployment rate leaves things out, gives us an incomplete picture, and partly because the overall national average is not indicative of the experience of some subpopulations within the whole U.S. population. So I'm here to talk about some of those things today. First and foremost, to note that full recovery has eluded African American men. They started out before the Great Recession, behind the rest of the population in employment, and experienced a deeper drop during the Great Recession, a drop in employment during the Great Recession, and have recovered much more slowly than others. Other groups have had a bit of that experience too. Less educated Hispanic and white men also have had those experiences of starting out behind, dipping deeper, and recovering more slowly. But even if the disparities weren't as great and weren't as important, it's also important to continue focusing on employment when the unemployment rate is low, in part because, as we demonstrated in the 1980s, every job loss makes two people who are still at work nervous. And so with an unemployment rate of 4.5%, about 9% of American workers today are worried that they are likely to lose their job in the next 12 months. One person gets laid off, and two others start to feel the psychological impact of that insecurity. And those insecurities are not equally distributed. African American and Hispanics workers are twice as likely, a little more than twice as likely than white workers to feel that insecurity. So, what's wrong with the unemployment rate? I'm going to skip from focusing on it now to use something else called the prime age employment ratio. It's important to note that when the Center for Poverty and Inequality got kicked off 10 years ago, people did not routinely use this data, this indicator of employment, and now it's routinely presented. It's highlighted in the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports. They always calculated it, but they have not highlighted it. You'll read it in columns in the Wall Street Journal and so on, and it traces, I think, to the emphasis that we've been placing on it. And what is it? It's the ratio of employed persons to the whole population, and then we further restrict that. The prime age part means we're looking at people 25 to 54, who should be mostly, our graduate assistants excluded, outside their schooling, all wrapped up on their schooling, and not yet facing retirement. It's preferred to the traditional measure, first of all, because it gives us a much better view of women's employment experiences over the long haul and for much of the 20th century. And furthermore, it draws attention to discouraged and disabled workers, who are going to be an extremely important part of the story before I wrap up here today. So this is a data chart that you see reproduced in the State of the Union book. The key point to note in it is that the Great Recession hit all of these groups except for the white women. All the other groups were substantially hit by it. Men of all racial and ethnic groups more than women of all the ethnic groups, but everybody shows at least a little bit of a bump down. White women, it's a bit more of a long secular downturn. You might not know this. The month of greatest female employment in U.S. history was January of 2001. The last month of the Bill Clinton administration. Since then, I don't mean to ascribe anything political to it, but it's been headed down since then. No group except for African American women, and them just barely, and in the most recent data, have recovered to the pre-recession employment level. So here's the pre-recession employment level, and here is the post-recession 4.5 unemployment rate employment level for all of these groups, and only for the black women are they back up to that level, and only just now. And what that's telling us is that this is a more sensitive indicator of people's experiences. There are still a lot of discouraged and increasingly disabled people who are out there in the population, but because they're not in the labor force, they're not included in the unemployment rate. This highlights the racial and ethnic disparities and shows dramatically how it was African Americans who experienced the recession more than did members of other groups. The blue lines, you can barely tell the color difference here, but the blue lines are for the African Americans. The difference between whites and African Americans, it went up from, for the men, went up from 10% to 15%. Among the women, from virtually 0 to almost 5%. So that, whereas the difference between whites and Hispanics did not increase, everybody went down in parallel. But for African Americans, the recession hit harder. When we break this out, and I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but when we break this out by education, we find that high school graduate or lower white and Hispanic men also have this experience of basically a sharper experience with the recession than did the rest of the population. So, as I have said, part of the problem of this traditional unemployment rate is that it leaves people out. It leaves people who are not in the labor force out of the calculation, and thus we lose track of them. So who are missing? In particular, the people who are missing are the, is that right? Yeah. Lost my place in my notes, sorry. Are people who are, I earlier described as discouraged and disabled. There's another excluded group that I failed to mention in the first remark, and those are the currently incarcerated and those who have had a recent incarceration experience and are now out looking for work, but highly discouraged. This is a chart I borrowed from a recent publication, and it shows quite clearly that, importantly, that the people of all these age groups were equally affected by recent recession, so that this is the change from before to after the recession, and throughout the prime employment ages, all of these ages are affected. And this is drawing attention to the fact that it's not people in school, it's not people who are retiring early, it is really a widespread and a broad phenomenon. And I just want to conclude by drawing attention to a book that was published 20 years ago. In 1996, Bill Wilson wrote a book called When Work Disappears, where he described the problems of the inner city, the problems of inner city America. And they were that jobs disappeared, and then social issues of the sort that we now see spreading to suburbs and the rural areas were visited upon those specific inner city areas. And what has happened since then has been that work has disappeared elsewhere. Work has disappeared for suburban workers, work has disappeared for rural workers, and we're seeing exactly those problems of incarceration and addiction that were restricted to and segregated to the central cities at those times have spread outward. And so what was called at the time an idleness problem has in fact spread throughout the rest of the country. Wilson was pushing back against that, saying it's not idleness, it's lack of opportunity. And that is my conclusion from analyzing the specifics of these data about the rest of the country as well. The problems of the inner city are now all of our problems, and jobs are central, A, to precipitating those problems, and recovery of those jobs are essential to bringing us back to full inclusion of all individuals within our society.